I just want to welcome you to the 7th in this series of events at the Wheeler Centre for Books, Writing and Ideas. I'm Ramona Koval, and it's just been fantastic coming here every week or so to hear about another book that we should have known about. We should have known a lot about in our Australian literature series of classics. And how many have been here before? Boy, that's good, isn't it? You're very good students, and you're going to get a big elephant stamp at the end. So I'm not going to tell you all about the origin of this series. You know by now. Today we're going to be looking at Helen Garner's 1977 novel Monkey Grip, one of the first successes in the then new Australian publishing house McPhee Gribble, founded by Hilary McPhee and the late Diana Gribble. Kerryn Goldsworthy is going to tell us about Monkey Grip, and she'll tell you all about what happens and who it happens to and how and why. But I thought I'd just tell you a bit about Helen Garner first. Her mother's family came from Melbourne, as she says, from the middle of the middle class. She says not too much culture on either side, though her mother loves music, a lot of golf playing, that sort of thing. It sounds very Helen Garner, actually. She went to Manifold Heights State School in Ocean Grove, and then the Hermitage in Geelong, where in her final year she was dux and she was head prefect. And can you imagine that this Nora character, which is possibly loosely based on Helen Garner, was head prefect at the Hermitage. She did arts with majors in English and French at Melbourne University, and she lived at Janet Clark Hall. Very respectable background. She tells a story that years after graduating, she bumped into her old honours supervisor for her honours thesis, and the supervisor said that they'd gone back to read Garner's thesis if there had been any evident promise of literary success, but concluded there wasn't. She travelled in 1967, as many of her generation did, to Europe, and then she returned to work as a high school teacher in Melbourne. And people who are as old as me might remember that in 1972 she was sacked from Fitzroy High School for, as Kerryn Goldsworthy says, giving an unscheduled sex education lesson to her 13-year-old students using all the proper words, or the improper words at the time. She lost her job as a teacher. It was a big scandal. It was on the front page of the papers, and she devoted herself to writing, to our great delight, I think. She worked on Monkey Grip here in the State Library of Victoria, just over the wall, working on a novel based on her diaries and her life as a single mother with a young daughter living with friends in a big rambling houses, or many houses in inner suburbs of Melbourne. And Monkey Grip was published in 1977. It became a bestseller, and went on to win the National Book Council Award for Fiction in 1978. Our lecturer this evening is Dr. Kerryn Goldsworthy. She's a freelance writer and critic and former academic. She lectured in literature at the University of Melbourne for 17 years. Now she lives and writes and teaches and blogs in Adelaide. She's a former editor of the Australian Book Review. She was on the Literature Board of the Australia Council. She judged the Miles Franklin Award. She's a writer of short stories. She's edited 4 anthologies of Australian writing, and she wrote a critical study of the work of Helen Garner in the Oxford Australian Author Series, published in 1996. She's been thinking about Helen Garner's work for many years. She first met Helen Garner in 1980. Who better to have tonight to speak to us of Helen Garner's Monkey Grip? Please make her welcome.
Monkey Grip, the title, for those of you who don't know this, refers to this thing, the monkey grip. And it refers both to, well, what Nora calls Jarvo's smack habit and her own love habit. Smack habit, love habit, what's the difference? They both kill you, she says at one point. But the point she's making about both of them is that the harder you try to pull away, the tighter the grip of the addiction, whether it's heroin or love. So what happens in the book really is that Javo goes away, he comes back, he goes away, he comes back, he gets off heroin, he gets back on heroin, and this goes on for the length of the book. And I'm going to be talking a bit later about how that works as a novel. But first of all, a little show and tell. This is a first edition. I was given it for my 25th birthday. And there's an inscription that says, Kerryn, May 1978, Phil B. It was a present from a friend of mine, rather amazingly considering, called Philip. Now, Philip, as some of you may know, is a name that turns up again and again in Garner's fiction. It's not always the same actual character. There's Philip stuff. There's a sort of Philip effect, and Garner gives it the name Philip from time to time. She was asked in an interview about all these Philips, and she replied, Philip has turned into an archetype in my work now. He's a sort of man who is very attractive to women for the very reason that he is unreliable. He's charming, talented, kind of seductively independent, a sort that women find irresistible. Now, Phil handed me this book, beautifully gift-wrapped, at my birthday party and said, here, this is what everyone's reading in Melbourne. It had come out late the previous year in 1977. There's a sequel to that story, which is that 30 years later, another dear mutual friend of mine and Philip's said, oh, I have to go to Phil's birthday dinner. I want to buy him a present. I don't know what to get him. I'd like to get him a book. Have you got any suggestions? This is a couple of years ago. And I said, yes, I do. Get a copy of The Slap, give it to Phil and say, here, this is what everyone's reading in Melbourne. Which she did. Now, he thought it was great. The thing about I found myself, when I was reading The Slap, whenever it was, 2-3 years ago, thinking again and again of Monkey Grip and thinking, oh, this is so much, the Monkey Grip of its time. It addressed some of the same concerns, it spoke to some of the same audience members, and it spoke with the same kind of urgent voice. There are lots of differences, but it seemed to me that The Slap was doing the same thing for the population of Melbourne and, by extension, Australia, that Monkey Grip had done 30 years before, and having the same sort of, gobsmacked effect on people. There was also the fact that the characters in their lives were things that so many readers identified with so strongly. As with Monkey Grip, people were looking at The Slap and thinking, oh, yes, I recognise that. I see this dilemma. I understand that person. Mainly, though, they're both novels of their time and place, and their place is, of course, Melbourne. When Phil said to me all those years ago that Monkey Grip was what everyone was reading in Melbourne, it took me a while to realise that it wasn't just that this was the cult book in the coolest capital, and therefore a very Melbourne book on that level. It wasn't just a fashion item. The connection between Monkey Grip and Melbourne goes much deeper than that. Garner's writing then and later represented and reflected Melbourne in general, or, some bits of it, but certainly the landscape. And Carlton and Fitzroy in particular, in a way that not a lot of writers had done before her. There are a few earlier writers that you might think of as Melbourne regionalists, or perhaps part-time Melbourne regionalists. The great social realist short story writer John Morrison in the 1940s and 1950s wrote some wonderful stories about various Melbourne suburbs, both working class and well-to-do. Frank Hardy immortalised Collingwood and Abbotsford as the fictional suburb of Carringbush in Power Without Glory in 1950. And George Johnston had told us a great deal that we didn't know before in My Brother Jack about the various kinds of suburban and bohemian life that were being lived in bits and different parts of Melbourne in the 1920s and the 1930s. But for those of us who were in our 20s in the 1970s, and for younger members of the audience this might be a bit hard to imagine, but babe, stay with me, there was still a strong sense that real life was something that happened elsewhere. that you hadn't really started to live until you'd gone to London, and it was always London. It was never Vienna, you know, or Tajikistan, or it was London. It was where you went. Real life happened elsewhere, and it was somehow particularly naff to write about one's own place. This was as true in popular music as it was in literature. I can remember exactly how taken aback we all were when Skyhooks turned up on Countdown in 1974, performing a track from their first album, Living in the 70s, called Carlton, Lygon Street Limbo. Even more shockingly, Shirley Strawn sang it in an Australian accent, rather than the fake American that was standard for Australian singers at the time. So not only were we hearing the word Carlton in a song, but we were hearing it with an unmistakably Australian vowel, Carlton. And on the same album, there's a song called Baldwin Calling and another one called Toorak Cowboy. This just was not something that you did, it was a new departure. Incidentally, all three of those songs are about either sex or drugs. There was a broadcaster called Billy Pennell on a TV documentary about the history of Australian rock and roll, who said of Skyhook's songwriter Greg McCainch, he broke down all the barriers, opening the door for Australian rock and roll songwriters to write about local places and events. He legitimised Australian songwriting, and it meant that Australians became themselves. Which is, you know, a hell of a claim, really. But Helen Garner was doing something in a very similar vein, and it pleased me greatly. I had just written that bit of the notes I've got in front of me, and I was doing it in tandem with rereading Monkey Grip for the 900th time, and I was, you know, getting towards the end, and sure enough, there's Nora saying, "We were listening to Skyhooks." And I thought, yeah, it's inevitable, really. Just. In a similar vein, some of you may remember an article in The Age just last month by a Melbourne nurse called Anne Myers, reminiscing about reading Monkey Grip the summer that it came out. And this is what she said. "It was Monkey Grip in early summer, and those pages seemed to turn themselves. Helen Garner was writing Melbourne into the literary landscape, and for the first time I saw my own world reflected back at me. In my 20s, I used to think that experience happened elsewhere, that reading about ordinary Australians would not be worth reading. Yet the American writers I read wrote about ordinary American lives, and I was happy to read their stories. And so I thank Monkey Grip. It opened up the city for me all those years ago. Like so many other emerging local writers, Garner gave us permission to embrace our own experience, to make it the dominant landscape, and to make it our own." I thought of this article this morning when Ramona put up a status update on Facebook saying, you know, reminding people that this gig was happening tonight, and saying she'd just been rereading Monkey Grip in preparation for it, and that her memories of the 70s were very, very different. From which I can only conclude that you were, you know, being a married lady and raising children.
Without drugs.
Without drugs, yes. Mine are actually much more similar, because I and my cohort lived in share houses. You know, we were fairly free-wheeling. There was, I have to say, less sex and a lot fewer drugs, but it was basically the same kind of, you know, alternative life. And because most of us were pretty serious students, there was also a focus on the work that we were doing that gave our lives a sort of forward impetus, which strikes me as the thing that's very much not happening in the lives of the people in Monkey Grip, which go round and round rather than forwards. And there's nothing wrong with that, incidentally. It's just more of an ebb and flow rhythm rather than a forward-pushing one. It's hard for someone who recognises the kind of life the Monkey Grip characters are living to imagine how that book might have been received by people who were living differently. And I don't know what the answer is to that, but whatever, you know, however the readers were living, that book did strike a chord with a very broad audience. And really the way the slap was received and took off was very, very similar to what had happened 30 years before with Monkey Grip. We've been asked to consider the texts in this Australian Lit 101 series as classics of Australian literature. And although I'm not very interested in the kind of literary criticism that gives books points out of 10 or says that this book is better than that book, I thought this might be a good place to consider briefly what makes a classic, and whether a book has to have exceptionally high literary values in order for it to become a classic, or whether it simply needs to have somehow found its way deep into the culture of its time and place. Books don't become classics just because some critic says they are. They become classics over time and through an accretion of agreement among all sorts of people: publishers, academics, teachers, critics, booksellers, the Wheeler Centre, and of course, and most of all, readers. All of whom decide together over time that these books are worth reprinting, worth rereading, worth restocking and worth adapting for the screen. Monkey Grip was Garner's first book, and in terms of literary craftsmanship and style and structure, or in terms of power and clarity of vision, it's not her best novel. Which is not to say that it's bad, only that I think a couple of the others are masterpieces, Children's Park and The Spare Room. But in the way that Monkey Grip affected so many of its readers so deeply, people like Anne Myers, it reminds me of another Australian classic that's also about women's freedom and the problem of romantic love. Miles Franklin's novel My Brilliant Career has all sorts of things wrong with it. It's not very coherent in its messages about feminism or nationalism, and it's visibly the work of a young and inexperienced writer. But the colour and the passion and the originality of it, the strength of the heroine's narrating voice, and the way that it speaks directly to the experiences of other women have endeared it to generations of readers and have earned it an enduring place in the Australian literary canon. And that seems to me to be perhaps the most obvious text to Monkey Grip was My Brilliant Career of its time, and for much of the same sorts of reasons. Monkey Grip is by no means the only book of Garner's in which she writes so perceptively and lovingly of Melbourne that some of the images stay with you permanently. It names a street, a park, a suburb or some landmark of Melbourne on almost every page. The Fitzroy Baths, the Southern Cross Hotel, Lygon Street, Grattan Street. The description on page 9 of a bike ride through Fitzroy to the Baths is one of the first things I ever read about Melbourne that made me want to come here. They're on bikes there's a group of them on bikes heading for the Fitzroy Baths. We roll in unison down the wide road and into the green tunnel, the cave of the Edinburgh Gardens. No one around, though it is 10 o'clock in the morning. The hoses flick silver strings onto the drying grass. We sweep round the corner into the Belgium lane where the air is peppery with the scent of cut timber, and even on this still day, the poplars flutter over the ancient grey picket fence. In other later work, Garner writes unforgettably about a Melbourne that's instantly recognisable even when she doesn't mention it by name. There's a short story in Postcards from Surfers called The Light, the Dark, which is about the whole Sydney-Melbourne rivalry thing. And of course Melbourne is the dark and Sydney is the light, and they are contrasted in this amazing, very almost micro story about a friend getting married and defecting from being a Melbourne person to being a Sydney person. The words Sydney, the word Melbourne do not appear, but it's one of the most intense, condensed summaries of that whole Sydney-Melbourne thing that I think I've ever seen. There's also a story in Postcards from Surfers called Little Helen's Sunday Afternoon, in which the title character sees a vision of her home city with a landmark that all Melburnians will recognise. Noah's yard was long and sloped steeply down to the back fence. The trees had no leaves, and from the back porch, little Helen could see for miles and miles, as far as the centre of the city. She paused to stare at the tiny bunch of skyscrapers like a city in a film, and at the long, curved bridge beyond them, with its chain of lights already flicking on. The afternoon was nearly over. In her later novel, Cosmo Cosmolino, the city she describes, this time with an even more sweeping and panoramic vision, is again not named, but it could only be the city that we're in. It was the season of winds. Air hissed all day and all night, long, tremendous, sharp and dry. It travelled in off the northern grasslands, the stony rises, the mighty basalt plains, barrelling furiously down the freeways, rolling empty cans in the streets, stripping the foreign trees, pressing back dark foliage in which the globes of lemons shone. Helen was unmistakably a regionalist, someone writing from deep inside the heart of her own territory at a time when almost all Australian writing, when Monkey Grip came out in 1977, almost all Australian writing that people were reading and paying attention to was either very gung-ho about being Australian, writing the great Australian novel, or alternatively, very hot on international influences and perspectives. Into that came someone like Helen Garner writing realist fiction about a recognisable Australian place. It isn't written self-consciously for a non-Melbourne audience. It's written from the inside with no explanations and no tourist guide type stuff. I don't know how many of you have read the short stories of Henry Lawson, but if you have, you might have noticed that there's quite a switch. Lawson went to London after he'd had some success in Australia. He travelled to London where he wrote more stories. The difference between the Australian stories and the London stories is that once he gets to London, he becomes the professional Australian abroad, and he feels obliged to start explaining strange words, things that they do in Australia that Londoners won't recognise, all that kind of stuff. But it's the stories from before that, I think it's from Wyler Billy Boyles, which came out in the 1890s, that are really far more genuinely regionalist stories in the same way that what Garner's doing in Monkey Grip and in her subsequent fiction. There's no concession to people who might not know the place. You just need to... It's like reading about, Ian Rankin's Edinburgh. You just have to kind of stumble along and do the best you can to recognise what's going on. Okay, so much for place. What am I doing? Oh my goodness. Briefly, something on Monkey Grip being a book of its time as well as of its place. Here's that nurse in The Age, Anne Myers again. It's such. I hope at least some of you saw it. It was a very moving piece of writing by someone who's a nurse, not a professional literary critic. A very personal piece of writing about what that book meant to her. She wrote, "A group of us had headed west, roaming up the coast in a rusty old wagon while Melbourne ticked through the long summer without us. We were due back at St Vincent's Hospital in a month to begin our graduate year. While driving between Broome and Darwin with massive skies and beautiful sunsets, I was head down reading by torchlight, aching to be cycling through the Edinburgh Gardens once again, into the green tunnel, the hoses flicking silver strings onto the drying grass. I read through the night, wishing I'd had a little of Nora's speed to keep me going. Even in my own country, I was homesick for my town. When Jarvo ended up in the emergency department of St Vincent's Hospital, I felt a funny warm glow. My first thought was, I wonder who was working that night. I might even have met him. Me, an uncertain, fumbling student nurse. Fiction had come face to face with my life, as though I was living in an enormous novel. Garner had brought my hospital to life, possessed a place whose corridors were as familiar to me as my family home. The thing is that, you've got to be a certain age. I think Anne Myers must be, Ramona and I are almost exactly the same age, and Anne Myers is probably somewhere in between us. To have been living that kind of life at that time, to have that book make that effect on you, it's very, very time specific. I can remember the professor of politics at La Trobe, Judy Brett, former editor of Meandrin, among other things, saying that she was quite sure Monkey Grip wouldn't have been published 5 years earlier. And I'm sure that's true, because apart from anything else, McPhee Gribble was a very, very special institution in the history of Australian publishing, and it was McPhee Gribble who took that manuscript on. It had in fact been rejected by a number of other more orthodox publishers. But 5 years earlier, people wouldn't even have been living that kind of life yet. Not really. There may have been the first stirrings of it, but nothing like what things were like by the mid-70s. Monkey Grip is in fact set in 1975. There's a reference somewhere to the summer of 1975. And 5 years later, it probably wouldn't have been written, because 5 years later, people were getting a little careful. People were living that sort of life and exercising that sort of sexual freedom and spontaneity in a way that was only possible in a small time span. The years after the pill and before AIDS. That's a small window. It's only about 15 years. And in their practices with both sex and drugs, that generation, my generation, the generation after us, had to, do some really serious thinking in a way that these characters do not do. It's a free for all. It's a bit shocked. If you haven't actually, I was actually a bit shocked reading it this time. I thought, God Almighty! And at one point, Nora says, I think we think too much about fucking, and I thought, you're damn right. Do the ironing. She does a lot of ironing, but I'll get back to that. Ironing, oh no, don't even get me started. It isn't just about sex and drugs. When I was reading the novel again to prepare for tonight, I was also struck by the emphasis on ideology and the efforts made by at least some of the characters to live by fairly stern political principles of various kinds. One of Garner's favourite phrases is the gap between theory and practice, and it turns up several times in her work. Many people think now that second-wave feminism, which of course is what these characters are living by, was all about equal pay and other material matters. But Monkey Grip reminded me how much feminist thought in this era went into the theory and practice of how women lived our sexual and emotional lives. There was a lot of that stuff going on as well. 15 years later, writing her later novel Cosmo Cosmolino, Garner was to judge these counterculture years of ideological purity very harshly, or at least she did so through the eyes of her character Janet. Janet says, "What were we thinking of in those days? For all our righteous egalitarianism, we were wild and cruel. We had no patience. Our hearts were stony. Our house meetings were courts of no appeal. People who displeased us were purged and sent packing. We hated our families and tried to hurt them. We despised our mothers for their sacrifice." Now again, I wasn't living at quite that extreme level, but that is something also that I recognise, particularly the last bits, the idea of breaking away from family. One of the things that Garner was doing that was very new was in fact writing about women's lives, women's feelings, the reality of how women spent our days. There's a very revealing interview with the novelist Thea Astley, who was born in 1925 and only died a couple of years ago. Astley won, I think, 4 Miles Franklins. She'd gone on writing all through the 50s, 60s and 70s when all the writers getting attention were men. She just quietly went on writing novels and getting the Miles Franklin for them. But she was asked in an interview about writing as a woman, and this is what she said. "I grew up believing that women weren't really people and didn't matter in the scheme of things. You've got to remember my age. Men didn't listen to women. I used to read books by feminist writers and I was filled with envy and admiration for the way in which they made women's problems and the woman's voice seem not only intelligent and interesting but totally credible. That was my first reaction to Monkey Grip, as a matter of fact. I thought, God, isn't it marvellous the way Helen Garner can deal with female situations of getting meals, I've always avoided meals, and deal with the mundanities of a woman's day and make it alive and intelligent and believable without looking twee. And I thought, I can't do this. How the hell do they do it? So it's very much a generational thing. If you grow up like in that era where you're sort of taught from birth that you're a second-class citizen and don't really have a voice worth listening to, it's very difficult to just go ahead and write a whole novel in a woman's voice and, be damned. So she was doing something difficult and brave as well as new with Monkey Grip. Nobody had written a book nobody in Australia had written a book like this before. In 1978, there were 2 major Australian National Book Awards, only 2. And in 1978, Monkey Grip won the National Book Council Award, and the Miles Franklin Literary Award went to Jessica Anderson's Tirralira by the River. The publication and recognition of those 2 books marked a turning point in trends in Australian literature. From this point onwards, there's a sharp increase in the number of books by women being written, published and critically recognised. Now, I'm not saying the reason for that is Tirralira and Monkey Grip, but women writers had entered an era in which it became possible to write books like Tirralira and Monkey Grip, get them published and have them win prizes. This was also very new. Both of those novels have heroines called Nora, which is an unusual name, especially for women of Garner's vintage, and whether one or both of them intended this, though I'm sure they both did, and it doesn't matter if they didn't, The name invokes one of the earliest feminist heroines in literature, Nora from Ibsen's play A Doll's House. Both Monkey Grip and Tiralira directly address the idea of rebellion against the kind of ordered and powerless domestic and sexual lives that women were, until very recently, and certainly in the 19th century, expected to lead. Now, I haven't got a lot of time left, but I did want to say something about the question of the diary. When Monkey Grip was published, a couple of hostile male reviewers said, "Oh, you know, she's just transcribed her personal diary and published it as a book." And much later, Garner said, "Well, yes, of course, my diary was the source, you know, but she said she did a huge amount of trimming and cutting and, you know, shaping and leaving things out and sharpening things up and whatever." To me, it's a non-issue, because there's people who've never tried to write a novel sometimes think that a novel is a sort of pure and entire thing that comes completely out of nowhere, that it's something a writer conjures up out of the ether, and of course it isn't that. A novel comes from what Yeats called the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, a line some of you may recognise. "I will lie down where all stories start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." That's where a novel comes from, and it's made of rags and bones, and some of them are foul. So, of course you're using your own experience when you write a novel. You're using your own experience of what people are like, what things can happen to human beings when they're not paying attention, or when they are. My view is kind of the opposite, that in writing a diary, Garner was writing a first draft. You know, as soon as you write down experience, you start to shape what has happened to you. You know, you don't just write it all down in a stream of consciousness. You select, you form sentences. You know, you're turning experience into writing, even with a personal diary. The critic Pam Gilbert made an excellent point writing about this. She said, "Monkey Grip clearly broke new ground in its selection of material. The text lies at the boundaries of two discursive forms, the discourse of literature and the discourse of the personal diary. It has to be pulled back into the framework of literature if the personal self-confessional diary form is to be read as," and she puts this bit in quotation marks, "universally significant." That's a really good point. You know, what was happening was that Garner was, yes, taking her diary, but attempting, by sheer, you know, technical know-how and craftsmanship, to turn it into something that would be relevant to other people's lives apart from her own. And in that, as we've seen, she was spectacularly successful. She uses some simple but powerful metaphors. Parallels are drawn between Nora's need to be loved and Javo's addiction to heroin. Households are surrogate families. Being in over your head in a love affair is the equivalent of being up the deep end of the Fitzroy Baths. It's not as if she's not using literary modes, both in her writing style and in the way that she tells the story. I was also recently reading Ramona's introduction to Cosmolino in the new series of Australian classics that text publishers are putting out. And I was very struck by, in particular, by one thing Ramona said, talking about Garner. "Such is her talent for working the language. At a climactic moment, she propels one of her characters and all of her readers right off the page, leaving us to ask the giddy question, how did she do that?" Now, I can remember the very earliest moment when I said to myself, how did she do that? And that was in 1982. I can remember it very clearly. I was co-teaching an honours class with the poet and Professor Chris Wallace-Crabb in Australian Lit, and one of the texts on the course was Garner's Honour and Other People's Children, which had just come out. And one of us, either Chris or me, can't remember which, doesn't matter, read a passage from Honour and Other People's Children. And there was just this little kind of gobsmacked silence in the room when we'd finished, and the question was, how did she do that? And this is what it says. The people, the characters, and this is important to know, are the current partner and the form of partner of the absent Frank. Frank isn't important in this particular scene at all, but the former partner, who's the mother of Frank... Frank and Kathleen are the parents of a child. Frank has now gone to live with Jenny. Kathleen has come to help them move furniture. And she's arrived, and she feels a bit uncomfortable about going inside. So, Jenny came out the front door and saw Kathleen dawdling by her car, arm along brow in the strong sun. She looked small, dwarfed by the big blue day, and unusually hesitant, leaning there, looking this way and that, squinting up her face so that her top teeth showed. Jenny felt a throb of almost sexual tenderness towards her, a hard spasm of the heart, a weakening in the pelvis. She darted out the gate and stopped in front of Kathleen, seized her wrist. With force of will, she kept the other woman's hand, studied with a peculiar flux of love her sun-wrinkled eyes, the marks of her shrewd expressions. They could even smell each other: flour, oil, coffee, soap. And under these, warmed flesh, dotted tongue, glass of eye, glossy membrane, rope of hair, nail roughly clipped. "Welcome," said Jenny. Perhaps they would never dare again. They stepped out of each other, frightened. She'd come a long way, actually, even since Monkey Grip, and that's an amazing vision. You know, it isn't just the writing, it's also the vision of how two people can connect in a moment when it's the last thing you'd expect. Very quickly now, I want to just make a point about the plot. The main thing I wanted to say about the plot is that if you're trying to live an alternative lifestyle that doesn't involve having a boyfriend, going out with the boyfriend, getting engaged, getting married, having children, getting domesticated, living with them for the rest of your life, if you're trying to make an alternative or, you know, find an alternative solutions to the problem of love and sex, you're not going to be writing a Jane Austen type plot. That all the Jane Austen plots move forward relentlessly, and everything that happens in the Jane Austen plots is about the forwarding of the romance plot, either blocking it or pushing it forward or pushing it sideways or introducing a complication or getting it back on track or whatever. So there's this unrelenting forward movement of plot in Austen, and it's to do with the fact that it's about the traditional romance plot where those things happen one after the other. But if you're writing about getting off that track, you've got to find a different shape for your narrative. And that's probably the main reason why Monkey Grip ebbs and flows and goes round and round and things happen and stop happening and start happening again. Because it hasn't got that forward movement towards, you know, love, marriage, mortgage, grandchildren and so on. The critic, Paul Saltzman from La Tribune, said probably the most interesting thing I've ever heard anybody say about Monkey Grip. He was talking about the woman's voice telling the story, and he said it's a style that allows voice to explode plot. What's important in Monkey Grip is not so much what happens, it's what gets said. Now, I'm running us out of time here, so I'll finish now. I want to finish. I knew I've always got too much stuff. I want to finish by reading you one of my favourite parts of Monkey Grip. It's a description of a bike ride, one of many in Garner's work. It's something Garner's always been particularly good at, probably because she's been riding bikes herself all her life. It's a favourite of mine, partly because it describes a route through the inner east that I came to know very well when I lived in Melbourne. And it seems like a good passage to finish with because it combines a number of the things that can be said about this book. Garner's growing skills as a stylist, the way that she so skillfully maps her beloved city in her writing, and the way that she uses the symbolism of everyday experience so that here a simple bike ride becomes a powerful image of freedom and progress in the heroine's life. And the shift from a free downhill run to the hard work of pedalling through a landscape full of words like narrow and closed is something that reflects the pattern of her affair with Jarbo, where the emotional pattern alternates between joyfulness and sad, hard slog. Here she is on Christmas Day, leaving her family with relief to go home to the household. I got on my bike and rode off through Kew Junction, up the hill, past the gardens of Raheen and the Catholic properties and the pine-scented dry ground of the edge of the golf course, over the hump to where the Studley Park Road opened out in front of me, half a mile of steady, inexorable downhill run. I let go and flew down it in ecstasy, head thrown back, mouth open, feet at 2:45, my bag of Christmas presents bumping against my back. The wind pushed at my front. The mudguards rattled so fiercely I thought the machine would fly apart. Down and round the wide metal curve, over the river, almost invisible among humped trees. On my left, the convent, low down on its medieval banks with ancient trees shadowing its courts. and then on to Johnston Street, slowing down from flight and back to legwork along the narrow road between the rows of closed factories. That's all, thank you.
So, you mentioned the Cosmo Cosmolino and the critique, that fantastic critique of the houses. But when you read Monkey Grip, there is a critique forming there of the way they were living, the way that the way they had to fight jealousy between the women. Yeah. And there's one woman character, is it Lillian, who she's annoyed with because Lillian took her boyfriend before they'd had all those feminist consciousness raising groups, so it was sort of before that, so she wasn't really doing it in the right order, and that she'd go to parties and the person who she just slept with for the last 3 nights would ignore her, and everyone had to sort of think that was cool. And I'm just wondering, when it did come out, that circle, was she seen as a sort of traitorous at all in doing a critique of the way the people were living there? Because it was there. The critique was sort of there in germination, wasn't it?
I don't know. I'm sure some people felt that. I think for the people who actually were around and who knew her at the time, I think people were much more concerned with more personal things, the way certain living people had been represented or misrepresented or whatever. But I don't think there was a more general critique along those lines, no. You've got to look for it. It's the stuff about sexual jealousy. What was interesting at the time was that everybody was very gung-ho about how we had to be ideologically sound and not monogamous and all of that. But no one knew how to manage the appalling emotional states that kind of life produced in both men and women. More in women than in men for reasons I think most people here will know. But one of the things about Monkey Grip I can remember, Helen saying this is an unconscious book. I didn't really know what I was doing when I wrote Monkey Grip. She said that. And I think one of the things she didn't realise at the time, though I'm sure she did later, was that confusion is not resolved. That nobody ever gets around to saying, hang on a minute, there's something wrong with all this gung-ho. We will not be monogamous, we will not be jealous, because it's making us all cry.
And take a lot of drugs.
And drink, and take a lot of drugs, exactly.
What about some questions from the audience? You have to wait till you get hold of a microphone. That's the only thing. What about an arm? Have we got somebody with a hand up soon? Yes, there's one there.
You mentioned the diary criticism for the first, for Monkey Grip. With the spare room, something similar happened. Where do you stand on that? Do you think it's fiction, non-fiction? Is it? I think it's fiction myself, but, it was criticised as being non-fiction, dressed up as fiction. What do you think about that?
I think that to say non-fiction dressed up as fiction suggests to me a fairly limited understanding of what non-fiction and fiction are. I would probably reiterate the point I made during the talk that, people, artists, especially writers, get stuff from all over the place. And it's difficult to put it this way. Nobody ever says that about D.H. Lawrence. If any of you have read Sons and Lovers or know the story of Lawrence's life, it's absolutely pure. It's nowhere near as mediated by language and structural shaping as Monkey Grip. Much less The Spare Room, which is again a far more crafted, carefully, put together. I think people make the mistake of thinking that the difference between fiction and non-fiction is about material. And that's not the difference at all. The difference is the one that Pam Gilbert was saying, that you take this material and you turn it into something that's going to speak to everyone. So I think that's what she was doing. I mean, yes, of course, everybody who knows anything about Helen's life knows that a lot of the stuff in The Spare Room was drawn from things that really happened and real people. But she has turned it into an artefact by working on it very hard as a craftsperson. That's probably what I would say.
Another question or comment? Yes.
Mine is probably a statement more than a question. I just was really interested by the way that you focus so much on the idea of the book being in a certain place and time. But I certainly wasn't 25 in 1977, but I am 25 now. And so are a lot of my friends, and we're still riding bikes in Fitzroy and through Edinburgh Gardens, and we're still addicted to love, some perhaps addicted to drugs, and in many ways addicted to the 70s, or the idea of what was created in that era. And I think I just wanted to make a claim for the way in which Monkey Grip is still a story for people in Melbourne now, and for young people living in Melbourne today.
I'd like to know what you're addicted to the 70s. I mean, what about the 70s?
I think by that I have... I mean, we talk a lot now about the idea of nostalgia, and nostalgia for perhaps the ideology and the lifestyle, I suppose, that was able to be created in that moment.
Even with all the struggles in that lifestyle that it
absolutely.
depicts.
I know a lot of people who have sort of read Monkey Grip and sort of really, really find something to aspire to in it, which is interesting and complicated and problematic, but there is a real a nostalgia and a connection to that now, I think. I don't know if there's any other comments.
There's a question of that. Does that surprise you at all?
Not as much as I would have expected to be surprised by it. It was a much simpler time. You know, this is the worrying world. I was thinking while I was reading the book again, I was struck, as I have been struck many times before, by the way that people don't even have a phone. You know, everyone in Monkey Grip communicates by either writing a note, or by writing a note and then getting on their bike and riding around to the house and delivering the note. Usually while they're snooping and reading their diaries, which Nora does a lot. It's one of the reasons she's so miserable all the time.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say something on to sort of clarify your question regarding why the nostalgia as a younger person. And I think partly that's to do with a lack of an ability to not have to begin with the kind of premise of cynicism that is very a strong thing and a kind of engaging thing for a lot of youth today, that there isn't that ability to be to really believe in anything, that you have to start out by knowing that you can't get anywhere with it. That's probably my feeling on it.
Is that so?
I know you probably know more young people than I do, but that's terribly sad. And I'm sure you're right. Another thing that occurred to me while I was reading the book was that Monkey Grip's a book about being young. You know, I'm nostalgic for it because I'm not, even if it were possible to go on living that kind of life, I'm too old and tired. If the idea that people who are 25 now, can read that and not recognise some of the freedom of being young, then that's terrible. And, there's nothing to be done about it, but it's a terrible shame.
But don't you always want to change the world when you're 25?
Deathly silence right there.
Yeah, isn't...
I'm another 25-year-old, and I think my friends and I were pretty jealous of... We wish we could afford rent in Fitzroy in North Melbourne.
That's what it is. That's the nostalgia.
And also 10 cents for a glass of port at Jimmy Watson's.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
But my question is, one of my favourite characters from the book was actually Grace, the 5-year-old and 6-year-old. And I suppose I don't know many 5-year-olds, but I think that's amazing that she could be out late at night and happy-go-lucky and drawing. But I think there's a quote in the book that says she might not be able to bowl or bat, but she's heard the curtain raised. And I think that's a great story about a character.
Yeah. I veer wildly on the subject of Grace between, again, rereading recently. Oh, my God, why are they letting that child stay up so late?
Till 2 in the morning in one scene.
There's a junkie outside the bathroom and, oh, no, and then I think back again, to the time when a friend of mine, when we were in our 20s, had a baby quite young. She was only 21 and she was on her own. And she just brought that kid to the university, and she and half a dozen other students in a similar position got together and organised a creche and lobbied the Vice-Chancellor until the Vice-Chancellor gave them a room, a space. This was before all the regulations came in saying that you had to have a PhD in child management before you were allowed to be left alone with a 2-year-old for more than 5 minutes. And they just all looked after each other's kids, and they all did really well. Things were possible. It was a much less regulated kind of a time, and those kids were all fine, So really, kids are much tougher than we think, I think. We worry about the wrong things with kids.
You could do that with your universities now, because you're customers and they need you. You should remember that. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you think you could make a case that the spare room is less infused with feminist kind of themes than Monkey Grip, and if so, whether that's just because Monkey Grip was written in 1977, around the time that Kate Millett's Sexual Politics came out and The Female Eunuch came out, or whether it could be attributed to something else.
I think it could be attributed fairly directly to the fact that when Monkey Grip came out, Helen Garner was 35. And when The Spare Room came out, she was about 67 or 8. And you think about different things at different stages of your life. When did The Spare Room come out? 2009, 10, something like that? Yeah. By that stage, you're thinking about your friends and you're thinking about death. Because, you have been obliged by the world to do a bit of thinking about death. And so your concerns are a little different. People don't talk, there's no sort of talk of feminism in The Spare Room that I can recall. But it seems to me that those sorts of friendships were forged in the early days of feminism. Women of my age and older have friendships that are now very interesting. Maybe they used to be before, I don't know, but they're friendships that were forged in those days when, you could. Even in the 1950s and early 1960s, the whole structure of society meant that women got hived off into marriages. Women were constructed as each other's natural enemies because we were all competing for men. And the feminism of the late 60s and all through the 70s, that was one really great thing that it did. It kind of exploded that myth out of the water, and women felt able to become real friends. And The Spare Room, to me, is as much as anything else a kind of pea-end friendship of a kind that women weren't really able to have before maybe 1971, I'd say.
We've got time for a couple more or one more. Come on. Yes, I knew that you were there somewhere.
I'd just like to hark back to the current 25-year-olds' comments and compare it to being young in the 70s. I just think when we were hanging around Carlton and Fitzroy in the 70s and perhaps living that book to some extent, we were sort of really naughty, and we were sort of out there and having so much fun, whereas now I know my kids that are in their young 20s, living that life isn't seen as anything unusual,
That reminds me, actually, because I didn't mention that Helen was from a very middle of the middle class and she went to private school and all of that. And you mentioned my experience. I mean, for kids like me who are from poor families, whose parents were working class, well, we didn't really think it was attractive necessarily to go and live in a slum because we were brought up in a slum. And we weren't actually naughty. It wasn't naughty. It was just like what we'd always been doing. I think you're right about being naughty.
So what you're saying is that you and Helen were aspirational in opposite directions.
Probably.
Just quickly, the business about the slum reminds me of something that I had forgotten. And I was going to talk about the way that Javo is described. He is described again and again, one might even say obsessively, as a repulsive object. 1 minute Nora's saying, "Oh, I love him, I just love him to death," and the next minute she is describing in great details the boils and pimples and flaking skin and,
But the blue eyes are always there, aren't they?
Well, the blue eyes white out when he's stoned, and even that's a signal. That's how she tells. But there's this insistence, on the physical disgustingness of the state of Jarvo that sits very, very oddly with the idea of him as a love object. That article by Anne Myers talks about giving a friend the book to read, and the friend can't read the book. She gets about 20 pages in and gives it back. She says, "Oh, Jarvo's horrible. I hate him. Oh, how disgusting. Why would she be in love with him?" And it's something Nora doesn't really understand about herself either. She says so several times. Grunge. This is another point, actually. Monkey Grip was probably an early precursor of the grunge fiction of the 90s. People were wallowing in physical unpleasantness.
A lot of boils, weren't there?
Boils, yes, boils. Naughty's an interesting. The idea that naughty and squalid somehow have anything to do with each other is something I'd need to think about some more, I think.
I think it's a good point, though. It's probably a good point to stop because we've run out of our time again, which is bewildering. Look, I just wanted to remind you that next time, which will be on the 19th, hang on, the week after. So today's the 19th, isn't it? No, when is
26th today.
26th. God, my life is rushing before my eyes.
It'll be the 3rd of May.
It'll be the 3rd of May. On the 3rd of May, we're going to be looking at Tim Winton's Cloud Street, and our lecturer is going to be Hilary McPhee of McPhee Gribble, who published, of course, with Diana Gribble, Monkey Grip. So come to that. I think it's booked out, so hopefully you've got your name down for that. Thank you so much, Kerryn Goldsworthy, for illuminating us tonight. Wasn't she fantastic? Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for coming.